All right, hello, Master Gardener newbies. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on what time of day you're listening. So, we're going to be talking about weaves in this module. I love this title, Battling Weaves, or How Did a Nice Plant Like You Wind Up in a Place Like This? I kind of stole that from somebody else, but I don't remember who. Weaves, weaves, and more weaves. Does that look like your vegetable garden or your landscape sometimes? I doubt it, but occasionally they get ahead of us, don't they? So, what is a weed? Let's take a moment to think about that. You have a definition in your mind? A lot of people say a plant out of place, and that's pretty much accurate, but I like this one. I didn't coin it, it was by the late Dr. Ralston. It's a plant dealing with an unhappy person. So, if it's in your yard and you don't want it and you're unhappy about it, it's a weed to you. Now, some people try to sell some of these weeds. You'll recognize the potted plant in the foreground here on a website that I won't mention by name, but you can see who it is. And they are selling dollarweed. Now you go, who would buy dollarweed? Well, when I worked in Chicago many, many years ago at Chicago Botanic Garden, we used it as a annual. It does not become invasive up there because it freezes, and it is used as an aquatic or water garden plant because of its unusual leaves. So one person's weaves is another person's bread and butter, I suppose you could say. When weeding, the best way to make sure you are removing a weed and not a valuable plant is to pull on it. If it comes out of the ground easily, it was a valuable plant. Now, I didn't coin that expression either, but think about that. Why are some of these plants very weedy in their habit? A lot of them have very thick underground storage organs, very heavily rooted, and as a result, they usually are very tenacious and resist being pulled out of the ground. Now, if your lawn seems like this, probably the best thing to do is R&R. I don't mean uh, rest and relax. I mean round up and replant. But many people are trying to get rid of the weeds out of lawns this bad off selectively. Usually it doesn't prove to work very well. Best thing to do is to start anew. So how do we win the battle? This is a really good question and not that easy to answer in many cases. First of all, and this is really a critical point I think, weed control is a process. A lot of people pull them up but they have no idea what to do next. They don't have a plan for keeping up with it or outpacing it, kind of like we saw in the last picture with the turf. If you kill out the weeds one day and you don't replant a while later, Mother Nature is going to recolonize that with something eventually. In Florida, weeds are difficult to control. Part of that is during parts of the year it's very hard to selectively control weeds out of our lawns because of the heat. Usually herbicides are very damaging to turf grasses in the heat. We'll talk more about that later in this module today. And I'll talk a little bit about how herbicides work and why they work. So, why do we fail? There's no plan, just action. Spray first, ask questions later. Just do it is not good weed control, to be honest. That no plan or lack of planning for renovation or replanting is usually lacking. So, what makes Florida the perfect place for weeds to grow, you ask? First of all, our soil temperatures remain warm all year round. Usually they don't go much below about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Once in a blue moon a little bit lower, but not much. Think about that. That's perfect germination for either cool season weaves or warm season weaves, so we have 365 days out of the year for germination of weaves. So mild winters also cause some of these plants that would normally die out as an annual to, I'll use a term that I got from a ag agent, perenniate, or a nice way of saying they don't work like an annual, they work like a perennial. Makes them very hard to control when they do things like that. High annual rainfall. Of course, we have most of our rainfall from June into September, but even after that, when we get into our drier parts of the year, fall into winter, usually we get about Rain about once every 7 to 10 days. That's enough to keep the ground moist, especially in the winter months, for winter weeds or cool season weeds to germinate and grow quite happily. Also, the high humidity keeps the soil surface damp when that dew forms in the morning, and that can also serve to help for germination of weed seeds. Weeds don't often die on schedule. Like I mentioned a little bit ago, it's often too hot to put out selective herbicides on turf grasses. Yet a lot of people do and burn out the turf or weaken it, thus creating more weed problems in the future. Many factors affect the activity for weed control. The more mature the weed is, the less likely we'll be able at controlling it, especially selectively like we try to in turf. So, rules of thumb: when the weed has flowers or has seeds on it, it's very difficult to control these type of plants, especially with selective herbicides. Um, a lot of times a herbicide doesn't move to the active site that is used to kill the plant. Also, another problem is if we're doing weed control is sometimes it is droughty and the weeds will not move the product around, or they're kind of in a dormant state, if you will. And so a lot of times I'll tell people water before you apply herbicide so you reactivate your weeds. Sounds crazy, but it does help. Here's where a lot of us people get into trouble. Too much of a good thing. Most herbicides usually have to be moved around in the plant tissue somehow, either in the xylem or phloem, the vascular tissue, to the site where it's active. Maybe in the root, it could be in the leaves, it could be in various parts of the cell. It depends on the exact herbicide. A lot of times some of these herbicides seem to not really work really quickly. You may notice that with glyphosate, also known as Roundup. It takes about 1 to 2 weeks, sometimes 3, to notice any change in the plant. So a lot of times people mix them very strong, the herbicides, and then they hit it hard. So they get that instant gratification of the plant starting to die. But if it can't move it from point A to point B to kill it, you've pretty much shot yourself in the foot. Typically when we hit weaves hard is they get this burn look shortly after application. Most herbicides won't give you that, in at least what is available for homeowners. Herbicides do come in various groupings. I won't go into a lot of detail here. Obviously, it's less important for you to retain that, but just kind of keep it in the back of your minds always. Some are growth regulators in the plant. They may be a hormone mimic, for example. And as you know, hormones in people do profound things in small amounts. Same thing with plants, and we manipulate hormones to upset the balance of the plant's ability to grow. Some herbicides will inhibit photosynthesis. I believe that is Roundup's primary mode of action. It prevents the plant from photosynthesizing and making energy properly. Some herbicides are seedling growth inhibitors. We would call these pre-emergent herbicides. Others will block amino acid synthesis. Those are the building blocks for proteins. Now, there are herbicides called cell membrane disruptors. These are not very common in homeowner herbicide packages. They are used in certain agricultural applications, and this literally, you can apply some of these and within 5 to 10 minutes later start to see where the plant is starting to look burned, or it looks like if you've ever had frost damage to plants where they're leaking the moisture out of the cells and the plant is literally weeping. Some will inhibit lipid or fat synthesis in the plants, so the plant can't make the cell wall properly. Now, if you remember some of the herbicides that we used in turf grasses up north, you would spray it and all of a sudden you get this weird vegetation starting to appear, which look twisted, cupped, or distorted. And that was a hormone mimic, 2,4-D being one of the most common ones that we used in turf grasses up north. Typically, we don't use 2,4-D on our warm season grasses down here because many of them are sensitive to 2,4-D, primarily our St. Augustine's. That's what I'm talking about. And I guess I wanted that animation to show all of a sudden the weed grows kind of funny. So this is the easiest way for master gardeners to learn weeds and what to do when you're asked about it. Divide them into three big broad categories. This will go back to our botany modules in a way. We have grassy weeds, and we know what a grass is. It has parallel veins. Some of them are annual grassy weeds, some are perennial grassy weeds. So which do you think would be easier to control, an annual or a perennial? As I mentioned, perennials are generally a lot harder because they have extensive root systems, usually to survive chemical treatment. So annual grassy weeds typically are easier to control than perennial grassy weeds. Then we have broadleaf weeds. Those are the ones that do not have parallel veins. They're dicots. Remember that from our botany? Then we have sedges. Sedges have a triangular stem, and if you were to cut it, it would be solid. So sedges have three edges. That's a good way to remember that one. So let's look at the veins a little more carefully on this grassy, quote, quote, weed here. You might look at that and go, gee, that looks maybe some kind of a lily family member. Probably is. I don't know exactly which leaf that is, but I can see the parallel veins. So I know that's a grassy weed of some sort. I may not be able to identify it beyond the fact that it's a monocot. And we've talked about this already, but annual grassy weeds are generally a lot easier to control than perennial grassy weeds. The one on the left, the annual, is some kind of a crabgrass. Which one I don't know. The picture on the right-hand side, the perennial, is Bermuda grass. And some of you are trying to grow that for a turf grass, but most people are trying to kill it out of their warm season permanent grass that they prefer, like St. Augustine or Bahia. Now, as I mentioned, annual grassy weeds are easier to control, but usually that's done before they sprout or emerge in the springtime with pre-emergent herbicides. Unfortunately, if you get annual grassy weeds or perennial grassy weeds mixed in with your lovely turf grass, there is no chemical that will selectively choose one over the other after it's up. These are broadleaf plants, and you can see they have non-parallel veins or netted veins, as I may have said in the botany modules. They don't necessarily have to be big and wide. It's just these are dicots. You remember that from our botany, don't you? Now you understand why I teach you some of those things. And these are sedges. They look grass-like, but if you look at the stem in cross-section, as you can see in the lower picture, you can see it's triangular. If you were to roll that stem around in your fingers, you would actually feel it bumping around. So sedges have three edges. They're triangular and solid. Grasses have round stems and are hollow. So I've alluded to the different types of weed control methods out there a little bit. We have pre-emergent. Those are herbicides that are applied to the soil surface, and as the weed seed tries to germinate, it's killed. It will prevent germination of certain weed seeds, but not all. That's very critical to remember. Part of that is the timing. We usually time pre-emergent herbicides for crabgrass control in our lawns. That is usually done in the winter months when people aren't thinking about doing a whole lot of selective pre-emergent herbicide treatments. Post-emergent herbicides work on existing weeds. In other words, you look down and you see the plant growing and you're not happy. So you want it out of your landscape. Some herbicides can injure desirable plants because they are usually targeting broadleaf plants, and many of our ornamental plants, other than those grassy things, are broadleaf weeds to the herbicide's mind, if you will. Then, of course, we know and love the last option, which is called mechanical control. Doesn't that sound better when I say mechanical control versus cultivating and hand weeding? I don't know why I put that in there. Oh, that's why. Because sometimes you get too close with some of these herbicides and you'll see the damage, such as these narrow strap-shaped leaves. Not sure what herbicide did that, but again, that's a herbicide injury to that particular little tree of some sort. So I've already talked about crabgrass a little bit, but a lot of people battle it and wonder why it's so hard to get rid of it here in Florida versus when they had it up north. First of all, crabgrass is a warm season grass. So is your Bahia grass. So is St. Augustine, like Floritam. So is seashore paspalum. We haven't talked probably about that in any of the modules. That one kind of came and went in the early 2000s. It didn't prove very well in Florida, but occasionally I hear about it, so I just lump it here. Zoysia is warm season grass, and so is centipede. So now we're trying to selectively control a warm season grass before it germinates in our warm season permanent grasses. You understand where this can get kind of dicey. Yes, it can damage turf. That's not well established. So crabgrass needs light in order to germinate. This is why we do not recommend dropping lawnmower blades at any time of the year because you get more light down to the soil surface. So mowing at 3 to 4 inches, which is typical for most of our warm season grasses, reduces how much light can get to the soil surface. There are methods in the madness, or madness in the methods, however you wish to look at that. It also needs to have warm soil temperatures, 55 to 60. Well, that is usually in our winter months that we cool down. Plant dropped a whole bunch of seeds in the fall, and it's starting to germinate usually about in February of the year. So what pre-emergent does is it prevents the weave seeds from germinating. It actually, as the plant tries to send out its first root initial, it targets the dividing cells of that root and it destroys it and it dies almost instantly. It has to be applied to the soil surface where the weave seeds are located. Most of the pre-emergent herbicides need to be watered in right after application because they decompose by the UV light that comes from the sun. Once you apply a pre-emergent herbicide, you don't want to break or disturb the chemical layer that's on the soil surface. So, in other words, you wouldn't want to now go after you put a pre-emergent herbicide. You wouldn't want. I talked about the in how it inhibits the cell division at that root initial a moment ago. Pre-emergent herbicides will last 4 to 6 months in the soil, but for active weed control, it only lasts about 4 to 6 weeks. Why do I tell you that 4 to 6 month is if you are putting down a pre-emergent in hopes of getting ahead of weeds for replanting of new sod, you're going to damage new sod with the pre-emergent herbicide because it's going to target those root initials of new non-established sod. That's why I said there can be dangers in some of this. I mentioned that to Graves and Sunlight before. I'm not sure why I've got it a second time. Um, I mentioned most of that, but our timing window is very narrow and very tricky for crabgrass. Here in Central Florida, usually our first application is sometime in about mid to late January. If it's a warm winter, I would probably bump that. There are many brands of pre-emergent herbicides. You'll see them here. I don't expect you to remember these off the top of your head. Some are easier to find than others. Some of these are not available at the big chain box stores all the time. Some of these are easier or better found at a garden center only. Post-emergent. So post-emergent is what most of us are probably more familiar with than pre-emergent herbicide. Post-emergent is applied to plants that are actively growing and they're up and already sprouted and germinated. Hence post, it's already emerged. Excuse me, it might be foliar active. For example, Roundup has to get in through the foliage of plants. It can penetrate into thin bark trees that you can kind of scrape off the bark with your fingernail, or if the bark is green on some plants or shrubs when they're younger. Some herbicides are soil active. Atrazine is one good example of that. In post-emergent herbicides, some are selective, usually to get rid of broadleaf weeds, and some are non-selective. So you have to know, is this a selective herbicide or a non-selective herbicide? I talked about some of the modes of action with the groupings, but again, some will damage the plant almost immediately on contact. They burn the cells, they disrupt the membrane, and immediately the plant starts responding. But most herbicides are probably more or less systemic in some way, either moving from the root system up through the vascular system up to the leaves to damage the plant, or from the leaves down to the roots, like I mentioned with Roundup, which is also known as glyphosate generic. Systemic herbicides can be, you know, so what about Bermuda grass? This is probably one of our most common, how do I get rid of this out of my turf, than almost any other weed question you'll ever get as a Master Gardener volunteer. Bermuda grass is perennial, as I've already said earlier in this module. So perennial grasses will take a long time to get rid of or control. Your desirable turf is perennial as well. However, your desirable perennial grass is a lot less tolerant to the herbicides that you're going to have to use, because there's no herbicide that can select Bermuda grass and spare our permanent warm season turf grasses. So we use non-selective herbicides, usually the glyphosate ones. That is the generic active ingredient in the trademark brand Roundup. The other one that you'll probably get is dollarweed. Dollarweed is also a perennial. It grows from seeds, rhizomes, and tubers. It's usually found in wet or compacted soils. It loves wet areas. Remember, I mentioned it was an aquatic plant at Chicago Botanic Garden where I worked way back when. Controls. There are selective herbicides because dollarweed is a broadleaf weed. It's not a monocot, in other words. So in St. Augustine, atrazine is commonly recommended, but it doesn't work real well. I find that Image, which is a trademark name for a herbicide, is a much better choice. Image is also known to control in St. Augustine grass sedges. It works quite well. In Bahia and Bermuda grasses, we have to use a 2,4-D based herbicide like Weed Be Gone or Trimec Southern. If you were to apply atrazine to Bahia grass or Bermuda grass, it will damage it. Unfortunately, people don't understand how some of these herbicides work. I'll use atrazine as an example because it's a root absorbed or root active herbicide. Both the tolerant species, like your turf grass, and the non-tolerant plant that you're trying to get rid of, a broadleaf weed, because atrazine is a broadleaf weed herbicide, both absorb the chemical in the same amount or similar quantities. So what happens, why doesn't it kill the St. Augustine grass if it's used properly and the temperature is not too hot? St. Augustine has a pathway to break down atrazine. It's an enzymatic process. Unfortunately, the process does not work well when the St. Augustine is under stress. What stresses St. Augustine? A short mow, hot conditions, and hot and or dry conditions. So the hotter it is and the drier it is, the more turf damage that occurs by atrazine. Now, why do I mention this so much is because a lot of the popular weed and feed products contain atrazine that are used on our St. Augustine grasses. And when does it get above 85 degrees in Florida? Well, some of you are probably thinking all year round. In some cases, it can almost seem that way. We've had some pretty warm winters of late. But generally speaking, the time. So here is a real world example. It happened up in Spring Hill when I was agent in Hernando County, and this gentleman shared the pictures. And this is why I don't recommend weed and feed. He applied it in in July, And he read the bag far enough to know that he had to put a second application about 6 weeks later. And he put the two applications down. So one was July and the other one was in about mid-September. And here you can see the line between the Smith home and the Joneses home. And you can see this is a man-made problem because of the sharp line between the two properties. Now, if you look really closely on the left-hand picture, can you see the circular leaves down there? Anyone recognize that plant? Yep, that's dollarweed. Good spotting if you caught that. And of course, I told you a bit ago in the module that atrazine doesn't do a really good job of dollarweed control, and here's a really good example of it, but it does control the St. Augustine quite effectively when it's hot. So you can see that what should have been a selective herbicide selected for the wrong plant, didn't it? And that's because he didn't read the directions in full that said do not apply above 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Most herbicides that are used on turf don't want to go above about 80-85. So read these labels very carefully. And as we've probably said sooner or later in the modules, that the label is the law. Atrazine is pretty persistent in our soils, anywhere from 3 to 12 months. Usually not so much in our warm season. It breaks down much more quickly than it does in the cool part of the year, but that's a pretty persistent herbicide. Contrast that with something like Roundup, which is you can replant in the area about 2 weeks after application. You could even do it a little sooner than that if you had to. So atrazine can be persistent. Let me go back. So I've talked about Roundup a little bit. Glyphosate is its generic name. It inhibits amino acid synthesis. I think I said something else earlier in the module of how it worked, but the point is all these take time to show the symptoms that it's working when it is a boil down. So a lot of our leaves, they translocate within the plant. They stop growth immediately, but you're not going to see the plant dying for 1 to 2 weeks, maybe a little longer, especially in the shorter, cooler months of the year. Plants ultimately die from dehydration and starvation. Kind of a nasty way to go as a plant, huh? I talked about sedges, but again, most of our sedges are perennial. There is a couple that are annual, but you really wouldn't be able to tell that by without really keying it out. That's something we just aren't going to do. So they usually have a very persistent rhizome, an underground stem. Again, they love it wet or compacted soils. So they're very common when people have leaking irrigation heads or something like that, or are overwatering, or haven't calibrated their system. So if I get a lot of sedge in an area, I know it's usually a wet area. On all of our warm season grasses, there's a product called Manage. It's safe for all of them. It's not the most common product to find on the store shelf, however. Bazagran is also out there, but it's less effective on purple nutsedge, which is fairly common. So I usually only recommend it for use in like Bahia. Image is safe only on St. Augustine and zoysia. So Bazagran goes on Bahia, Image goes on St. Augustine's like Floritam and zoysia grass. Weed control, how much? Well, never a good answer to that, but I think this sums it up. Yeah, kind of seems to be that way, doesn't it? Or as long as your knees, back, and sunscreen holds up. Now, I do have a neighbor around the corner from me that I come home and I'll see him sitting out there with a 5-gallon bucket, and he hand pulls the weeds out of his turf all the time. He loves to do it. Maybe he just needs to get away from the realities of life, and that's how he does it. I don't know, but he's out there a lot. Landscape beds. Unfortunately, there are not many options out there. A few chemicals are selective. In other words, if you get weeds in and amongst your pretty flowers and shrubs, there's nothing you can spray over the top of the pretty flowers and shrubs that'll spare the pretty flowers and shrubs and kill the weeds. So really there aren't any options that way. Most pre-emergent herbicides, you've seen them out there, the preen and the shake and something out of the bucket, the plastic thing that they have, don't work as well as you'd like. And some of them can be damaging to not well-established woody ornamental plants, and they could potentially be damaging to herbaceous perennials if over applied. Read the directions very carefully, but again, from my experience with pre-emergent herbicides in landscape beds, they don't work very well. So that boils down to that last line of defense against weeds, a mechanical option. That's a nice way of saying getting out there, pulling it up or hoeing it or something on that order. I love this picture that I stole off the internet a while back. Here's a young man smiling to the camera wearing a suit and tie, and he's out there hoeing up weeds. Yeah, right. Yep, that's how we usually see our master gardeners. They're bent over, humped over, and pulling out weeds and trying to keep the bugs away and the sunscreen out of the eyes. So then we get asked about the weed block or the weed mat. All right, let me tell you what's going on here. At least this product is honest. If you keep on looking down, the name Weed Block Premium Landscape Fabric stops weeds for years. Doesn't say how many years. More than one is years, right? So all of them eventually fail. And this is what happens when you put down a weed barrier or weed mat. What happens is you put mulch over top. The mulch starts to break down into nice, beautiful, rich soil-like material. And all of a sudden, all those weed seeds that blow in land on the nice earthy material that you've been putting or been making on top of that weed mat, and then those weaves germinate and those little itty bitty roots manage to find their way through the weave of the weed mat. And then you try to pull up those weaves, and what happens? You pull up the mat in the process too. Again, weed mats are never ever permanent. So a lot of people want to try to spray in the ornamental beds, but you can see by these pictures that something got onto the plant in one way or another. Now the picture on the right, that if that were Roundup damage, I don't know what herbicide was used. If I get Roundup on the foliage of a desirable plant, if I quickly, within a few minutes of application, rinse it with a lot of fresh water, I will prevent that kind of damage. So you can, if you do an oopsie in a spray with Roundup, if you rinse it off real quickly, it won't damage the plant. So it happens to the best of us. I've been known to do a little edging with the glyphosate Roundup uh, a lot. Now, there are different ways to do different things. If you go to Disney, for example, you'll notice that they don't have any mulch around most of their landscaping material because every couple of days they're out there, a whole bunch of money and minions out there hoeing in between the individual plants. So that's one way to do it. So spacing the plants where you can get a garden hoe in there may be your solution to the problem. Or some people put plants to get so close together, like you can see in the picture that just popped up, that it's real hard for weaves to find a toehold in there. Now, in some of your subdivisions, that picture on the left probably won't work. So, most of us will employ mulch. How does mulch really work? It excludes light from the soil surface, and weed seeds need light in order to germinate. So that's the primary way how mulches prevent weeds. Some mulches do put out some alleliopathic or inhibitory chemicals that will kind of work sort of like a herbicide, if you will, but they don't last forever in that regard. Mulches won't get rid of existing perennial weeds. So if you mulch over the top of something that had a big tuber or stem or rhizome or runner, it'll pop right through the mulch. Now, what some people may do rather than landscape fabric or weed barriers is to use some newspaper. There are other benefits to landscape mulch. One of them is it does buffer soil temperature, especially when we cool down in the winter and we get a couple of cool nights. It'll keep the soil a little warmer. It'll also keep it a tad cooler in the summer months so there's not so much sun hitting the root system. It prevents water loss by evaporation. It suppresses weeds, as we've already been talking about. It prevents erosion. It helps improve soil texture, would be a better way to think about it than structure, but let's not split it here, okay? And it improves water infiltration. When raindrops are coming down, they're coming down at a high rate of speed, and when they hit the soil surface, if there's mulch down there, it kind of serves to break up that water droplet and coat the soil surface with water a little better. Now, there are lots of things that can be used as mulch, and we recommend that it's a plant-based mulch. No rock or rubber, please. So a lot of people turn to cypress mulch. We try to steer people away from cypress mulch whenever we can. Part of the reason is we're harvesting it out of our wetlands of Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida, the Carolinas, and we're doing it at a rate faster than what is being grown. So rather than using cypress mulch, I would recommend either pine bark, pine needles. Uh, Heck, if you want to use a red mulch, not my favorite, at least the red mulch is recycled wood. Usually a whole bunch of pallets or something like that are ground up, and the colorant, the red colorant, is to disguise the fact that it's from different sources and it's not the uniform brown. So cypress mulch, a lot of people also use it because they think termites won't eat it. This is simply not true. Termites will eat cypress mulch quite effectively. Now, some people are saying, well, what about all those old Florida cracker style homes made out of cypress wood then? Remember, that was old growth cypress, and they use the heartwood of cypress to build the homes. What we are harvesting now for cypress mulch is usually very young and doesn't have that the interior heartwood. It's softer wood, so termites will eat cypress mulch. So as I mentioned, there are plenty of alternatives. Pine bark, melaleuca, which is known as the punk tree. It's an invasive exotic that is in the Florida Everglades. We're actually taking melaleuca, harvesting it, and turning it into mulch. Now, someone's probably going, won't that start growing in my yard? Well, they heat treat the melaleuca mulch to kill any of the seeds from the melaleuca tree. Eucalyptus grows very quickly and is being harvested from plantations. Pine straw is a byproduct of lumbering and forestry. It also, before they harvest the trees, they'll rake the pine bark. Grass clippings can also be used as mulch if you want. I don't think it's the prettiest of it. Oak leaves I think are a fairly decent looking mulch, especially in the more natural landscapes with a lot of azaleas and things. Heck, that's probably one of your best ways of recycling those oak leaves rather than composting them is to use them as mulch. Or use that underneath more pretty mulch as a money saver. That may work too. Utility mulch, I'm not opposed to it, but again, some of the utility mulches can vary a lot. Sometimes it'll have weed seeds in there or other plant parts that can reproduce, so be careful with that. It does vary in quality and consistency. Usually the utility mulches break down very quickly, which is okay if you're trying to build up soil organic matter. But again, that may not be your objective when you're doing it in your landscape. Now, if you're going to start a whole bunch of veggie beds, I have known people that have gotten the utility mulch and turned it into nice, rich, earthy soil in a short amount of time. I mentioned the oak leaves. In some cases, that can be the best solution to when people can't get the grass to grow under their oak trees. Turn it into a quote self-mulching bed. And now you don't have to put those oak leaves into a plastic bag and pay someone to throw them away. Uh, Also, if you are recycling these oak leaves and your grass clippings, that equals about one fertilizer application in a year because there's quite a bit of nutrients in the leaf tissue. Now, if somebody is thinking, well, gee, if I put all these oak leaves down, won't I acidify the soil? Yes, but remember where we're starting with most of our soil pH. As a rule of thumb, we're generally on the alkaline side of the pH scale. So it's really not an issue because of that. And most plants prefer to be on the acid side of the pH scale anyhow. Tips for mulching. Mulch can replace turf where it's not doing real well, and you make a larger bed, and voila, you solve the problem. Now, the only bad part about mulch is when we start piling it against the stems of and trunks of trees. Think of it like a wet band-aid against your skin. If you had a wet band-aid against your skin for several days and you peel back the band-aid after several days of being wet, what's your finger going to look like or your skin going to look like underneath there? Yeah, it's going to look icky. Now think of moist mulch against the stems of plants or trunks of trees for days, weeks, months, years in some cases. This can cause pathogens to enter into the plant. So pull back mulch by a couple inches away from the stems of plants, please. Proper mulching, 2 to 3, maybe 4, but now you're getting kind of pricey if you're buying it, is plenty. And that'll generally need to be replenished a couple of times during the year. Here's how I like to do it. I like to do it right after the rainy season's over and it's starting to cool down, but before the winter weed season begins, which is usually November, December. So I'm ahead of that. And then I like to remulch right about March, April before it gets too hot and we get our summer rains returning. And usually you get a bit of a step ahead if you do it at that time. Here is the volcano style of mulching I was talking about just a moment ago. I don't know where this started, but it needs to go like the dinosaur and go extinct. But I see this becoming more and more of a problem. So just say no to the volcano. How much mulch? This is a handy little calculation table, but again, 2 to 3 inches, and here's how you can figure it out: length by width. Multiply the area by 0.25 to determine cubic feet of mulch needed. And from there you can divide the cubic feet by how many cubic feet are in the bag. The standard is usually there's 2 cubic feet in each bag, but some brands are cutting it back to 1.5. You know, there aren't as many Kleenex in the boxes there used to be, remember? So that'll conclude the module of battling weeds, or how did a nice plant like you end up in a place like this?